Good morning. I want to share with you a little article I wrote. It's called Why I Organize. After 7 years as a researcher with locals of the Service Employees International Union, I sat down with my 74-year-old father to look at some family photos a few weeks ago. The photos contain a story of Jewish refugees escaping pogroms and Nazi death camps to find a better life in America. The memory of the Holocaust is a big reason why my parents spent their careers studying and teaching movement history and why I became a union organizer. Within the contents of that dusty brown box stored in a cobwebbed corner for the past 15 years, neatly folded in scrapbooks and envelopes wrapped in old plastic bags, were pictures of my father, his brother, and their parents in 1950s Maryland. There were other photos and family letters of my grandparents on my father's side, and my mother's. In one family photo, I sat on the floor, clutching my head. I drank too much red wine at my bar mitzvah back in Charlottesville, Virginia. As we flipped through shoeboxes of photos, old letters, and scrapbooks, the memories that these triggered were overwhelming. The story of how the Nazis came to power when my grandfather, Theodore, was a senior in college. 2 months later, Adolf Hitler passed the Civil Service Restoration Act, which expelled Jews from the universities and government jobs. My grandfather never graduated. He boarded the SS Manhattan in Hamburg and arrived in New York City on May 16, 1935. The history of why my father, Nelson, like many first-generation Jews, recent immigrants, the reason why he got involved in the civil rights, peace, and labor movements. This is it. It's the Holocaust. While many of his colleagues and comrades got jobs as Teamster truck drivers, auto workers, and even teachers, my dad became a historian. As a kid, I heard him often quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are doomed to repeat it." When Adolf Hitler's Germany began to demonize, harass, round up, deport, and later murder Jews, things happened in the U.S. as well. During the Great Depression, while Hitler was building detention centers and broadcasting hateful speeches, blaming Jews for the unemployment and hard times German workers faced, union militants in the United States organized to unite workers across ethnicities and religions. Poles, Italians, Germans, Irish, English, Jews, Catholics, and Protestants, whites and blacks, to organize together in solidarity for good-paying union jobs where one could raise a family and earn a piece of the American dream. There were courageous general strikes in San Francisco, Minneapolis, and Toledo in 1934. It seemed like the whole city was on the picket line, just like the teacher strikes that we've seen recently. A few months after my grandfather landed in New York fleeing Nazi-occupied Berlin, a few militant unions and organizers broke with the slow-moving hierarchy of old guard craft unions to form the Congress of Industrial Organizations, a network to build off the momentum from the energy of the 1934 strike wave. It was this New Deal alliance between immigrant and native-born workers, restless radicals, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt that overcame scapegoating and division in America, brought the nation out of the Depression, and beat fascist Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, Imperial Japan in World War II. My great-grandfather, Herman, was from Lviv, or Lvov. It was also called Lemberg, a city in Eastern Europe's Galicia. It's now part of Ukraine, but it was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire before World War II, and then Poland, and then the Soviet Union. My great-grandfather Herman moved to Berlin before World War I and fought for Germany in the Great War, earning a box of medals on the Eastern Front. In the 1920s, the years of Germany's Weimar Republic, or Weimar Republic as they say, he became a successful merchant. a small businessman, but he lost a good deal during the global economic downturn, the Great Depression at the end of the decade. My grandfather, Theodore, was born in Berlin in 1911. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler seized power, he was studying law and economics at the Friedrich Wilhelm University of Berlin. As a kid, my dad would recall stories he told. One day, while sitting in a lecture hall taking notes, he was startled by a loud bang. A Nazi brown shirt. Classmate behind him, he had been playing with his loaded pistol, and it accidentally went off. On April 7, 1933, Adolf Hitler signed the equivalent of an executive order, barring non-Aryans, principally Jews, from the government civil service. On April 25th, the government barred Jews from no more than 5% of any public school. There were quotas. My grandfather, Theodore, was expelled his senior year in college. He immigrated to the United States using a phony student visa. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, a refugee resettlement support group like the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society that Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue fundraised for. This group helped my grandfather find a job as a salesman in a small town of Frederick, Maryland. There he met my grandmother Beryl and ultimately opened a small 5-and-dime convenience store. Going through a scrapbook and letters from the late 1950s where my grandfather had belaboredly petitioned West Germany for compensation for Nazis' seizure of our family property, we uncovered some surprising details of the past. After the Nazis annexed Austria in March 1938, Poland passed a law that Polish Jews who had been living abroad more than 5 years could not return home. Many wanted to flee Germany and Austria for good reason, right? Nazis began deporting Polish Jews against their will in October that year, 1938. Stuck between two countries that didn't want them, thousands were crowded into the refugee camp in Sebastianów, in Poland on the German border. Herschel Gierspan, a son of one refugee family, he shot a German official in Paris, France. To retaliate, German paramilitaries and police vandalized and broke the windows of German businesses and synagogues, beating people up. Afterwards, many were sent to concentration camps in what is now known as Kristallnacht, Night of the Broken Glass. My great-grandparents, born in Galicia, left Berlin to return to Lvov in 1937 or 1938, we found out. When the Nazis invaded, Jews were rounded up and imprisoned, sealed into the Lvov ghetto, where my great-grandparents stayed until they were deported to the Auschwitz concentration camp. When the Nazis invaded Poland, my grandfather's brother, Duno, was living in Warsaw. In a scrapbook, we found an article cut out from a local paper that recounted the letter he sent my grandfather, how he escaped Warsaw during the Nazi invasion, traveled east to the Soviet Union, then to Japan, and then across the Pacific to San Francisco. At the port, they were denied entry. They had U.S. immigration quotas. The family traveled south, ultimately settling in Mexico City. My grandfather was quoted in the article, recounting how his brother Duno and wife Nina and 7-week-old son, a newborn Tommy, they fled Warsaw along with 20,000 other refugees. As they passed through a small town, German warplanes thundered overhead, bombing the refugee caravan. They survived hiding in a cellar. Amidst the wreckage above, they found their car, undamaged, and were able to keep fleeing east. This story is why my dad went to work for a civil rights newspaper in Birmingham, Alabama, in the summer of 1966. He led a wrench strike while a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley in the late 60s. And it's why he became a volunteer organizer with the University of Virginia Living Wage Campaign, when we lived in Charlottesville in the late 1990s. In many ways, it's also why I organized protests, walked precincts, distributed leaflets, and sat through long, boring meetings, crunching spreadsheets late into the night as a union researcher and community and labor organizer. Only a strong, multiracial, working class movement can stop politicians and bosses from using racial and religious hatred to divide and conquer. Politicians and corporations have always used these tricks to break workers' unions and deflect blame from the consequences of their own reckless wars and greed. It happened in Chicago in 1919, where the slaughterhouse owners whipped up racism in the city to break a union organizing campaign, leading to race riots. It happened again in the 1980s, where to break the packing house workers' union, meatpackers shut down their Chicago factories, opened new ones in Nebraska and Iowa, staffing them with undocumented migrants supplied by human traffickers, contracted with Tyson's Foods to recruit cheap labor from Mexico. German corporations threatened by socialist, communist, and labor unions turned to Adolf Hitler and the Nazis to deflect workers' economic frustrations towards anti-Semitism. And that rhetoric quickly spiraled out of control. My family's story is like many refugees, like many Americans who made this country great. It's similar to the story of the Pilgrims, who escaped the religious persecution of the British monarchy, landing on Plymouth Rock to build a city on a hill where they could worship in peace as they wished. It's like the story of the Quakers, who, fleeing persecution, founded Philadelphia as a city of brotherly love. Quakers who advocated for peace and an end to slavery. That religious denomination formed during the English Civil War, a time when the British beheaded their king, and diggers and levelers, emboldened by the Protestant Reformation, claimed that men were created in God's image and that the land should be owned by those who work it. My story is the story of many immigrant families and their struggle to build a dream here. The Irish who made Boston and New York their homes after fleeing the potato famine, persecuted by large landowners. It's the story of Salvadorans who sought refuge in Los Angeles following the assassination of Jesuit priests like St. Archbishop Oscar Romero. It's the story of Mexican peasants displaced by haciendas and cheap Monsanto corn after the passage of NAFTA. My immigrant story is the story of the migrant caravan exodus, marching out of Honduras to escape the death squads and tear gas of drug cartels and military police run by Trump-backed strongman Juan Orlando Hernandez. Today, over 10 years after the stock market crash of the Great Recession, it's funny how things have spiraled out of control so fast. Net immigration is at its lowest level since 1992. The percent of civilians working, the labor force participation rate, which is a true gauge of unemployment without all those statistical gimmicks make the economy look good, is at 62.9%. It's been stagnant since the end of 2013 and declining since the Supreme Court appointed George W. Bush president in 2000. But rather than get America working again, Trump has blamed Mexican migrants and Central American refugees for taking jobs and bringing crime. Despite economic stagnation and declining real wages, the stock market is reaching its record highs 2 days before Trump's declared roundup of undocumented individuals this past weekend. The stock market reached a record high. What happened? Things have changed so fast. And the economy is far out of whack. People want somebody to blame, somewhere to vent their anger, frustration, and rage. But to be honest, as long as we breathe, there's hope. Even with the barbed wire checkpoints and Panzer tanks rolling through the streets, 300,000 Dutch workers in Amsterdam went on strike in February 1941 to oppose Nazi efforts to round up and deport Jews to death camps. In 1935, as my grandfather landed in New York, past Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty, while American workers still remembered the recent mass strikes like in San Francisco, Toledo, and Minneapolis, many were also listening to the fascist rhetoric of leaders like Father Charles Coughlin, a nationally syndicated radio talk show host. But that fall, a group of union leaders and shop floor militants split with the entrenched officials of the old ossified labor bureaucracy and the fiefdoms that had kept workers back. They knew something new was needed, was necessary to meet the challenge of the times. America walked out on strike for a strong union and a New Deal. And from the car factories and steel mills, mobilized a generation of working families across racial, ethnic, and religious lines to unify the country, raise the standard of living, and fight the threat of global fascism. We've done it before, and we can do it again. You know, as Mark Twain said, history doesn't always repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes.